I wish I would have known back then that there are ways to buy property and rent it, get your money back out and not have any money in it and be infinite returns forever. We all have to start somewhere, and it was a good building block for me.
Take us a little bit through that journey from that first rental where you were really nervous and had a home inspector and, looked in every nook and cranny. And now it's like, I'm buying 3 deals a week. What's going on, right?
Yeah, our first rental, we had some cash sitting idle. It's like, let's didn't know much, didn't know anything about wholesaling. Never heard about wholesaling. Didn't know about, and not having to have our money in it. So we had typical commercial loan, 20% down we had to get. Ironically, it was the easy math rental. ARV was right about 100,000. I think we paid 101 for it. Rent was $1,000 a month. We put 20 grand down, kept 5 grand aside for emergencies. If the AC went out or heater went out or roof or something. And 3 years later, we cash flowed zero. We hadn't cash flowed anything. It was a 15-year AM, and there was no cash. However, it had appreciated, and it was worth about 120K. So, and at this point, I didn't know anything about 1041s either. 1031, sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
So we sold it, used those funds to buy and rehab our first flip, which again was part-time. I was in IT at the time, and I did most of the work myself. I knew I could hire people. I knew if I wanted to scale, I'd have to do that. But I really wanted to get my hands in and have a better understanding so people couldn't BS me as much later on. Did most of the work on that one myself, took a year, and then took right at 6 months to sell it. And from there, we just kind of rolled on and had fun with it.
Yeah, I think that's a common journey that I hear. We buy our first rental a lot of times, at least. I don't know if you and I are the same generation, John, but I know we're not the same generation as the young guys and gals that we know in some of our groups, right? But we weren't brought up on seller financing or creative terms. It was a little bit tougher to learn. You were serving, right? So again, you guys heard my intro. John is a Marine, so we appreciate your service, of course. But you were doing something, much more noble than what I was doing at that same time, I'm sure. But learning about real estate, you'd save up 20% down, and then John talked about a 15-year AM. What that means is it's a 15-year mortgage instead of a 30. So the great part is you're going to pay a lot less interest, except you're paying a lot more principal, and interest up front because your payment's higher. But that helped him when that property went up a few years later. It went up about 20 grand, but he also had paid down a whole bunch, right? So those are a couple terms that John was talking about there, and again, that's kind of the journey a lot of our guests talk about. So, John, going from a Marine, again, you're enlisted, you're doing what you're doing over there. What was that mindset shift from an IT guy, Marine/IT guy to going into full-time real estate as an entrepreneur?
Several aspects there. I'll go back to when I was in high school. My parents had a couple rentals when I was a kid growing up, and I think I was a senior in high school, 17. People moved out of one. They'd been there for about 10 years. And we've all been in that house. We've all been in that house where the dogs never went outside, wood floors, smelled great. And since I was in high school, I got the job of fixing it. And that was an interesting experience by itself. But at one point, I was bleaching the floors, trying to get the smell out, which now I know how to get the smell out better. But I said something to my parents about, why aren't you upset? Why I would be furious. And I said, well, we're not happy about it by any means, but they already paid off the mortgage. I was like, what? So it's kind of like free money for the rest of eternity now? And they're like, well, I mean, kind of. And that kind of got my mind thinking. It just kind of put that little seed in my brain. Later on, got out of the Marine Corps, was working here in Oklahoma City, and Amy and I talked about eventually we needed to get rentals because people would pay down the mortgage, and then we'd have this asset that we own free and clear, and we would get the funds or the rent checks after that, and just being infinite returns at that point. I wish I would have known back then that there are ways to buy property and rent it, get your money back out and not have any money in it and be infinite returns forever. But hey, we all have to start somewhere, and it was a good building block for me.